Matt, you will have no more than 20 minutes to present your research and to defend your findings. Before we begin, do you have any questions?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Then we will begin this presentation in 3.
Look at me. What kind of assumptions do you make about me? What do my clothes tell you? What does the way I talk tell you? What about my hair? All of these are choices that I make in order to influence the way other people, like you all, perceive me. Know what about the things you can't see, like my septum ring? Does that change your opinions of me? What if I told you I was disabled? How would that shift all those preconceived notions? Understanding that someone is disabled shifts the way the public views them every single time. The same concept applies to comics and those that write disabled characters. The way that comic book authors view disabled people affects how they write disabled characters, whether they realize it or not. This is what's called implicit bias. Everything in the world around you impacts the way you view specific social groups. When you aren't aware of how those views impact your thoughts and your interactions with that group of people, that's an implicit bias. These can impact any and all social groups. However, for the purpose of my research, I studied how it impacted specific groups of disabled people in relation to the abilities given to their comic counterparts by comic book authors. Specifically, I studied are physically disabled characters in Marvel and DC comics more likely to have certain abilities based on their disability. For those of you here who have been living under a rock, comics are a typically American art form that use drawn images to express stories and ideas via an assortment of panels. Normally, these panels are found in the book or in the newspaper, but they can also be found online in a PDF format. The two main distributors are Marvel Comics and DC Comics. There are many smaller distributors, but for the purpose of my research, I decided to focus on Marvel and DC. To complete my research, I chose to use quantitative correlational research. As I was trying to determine if there is a relationship between the type of disability and the type of ability assigned to the hero, which are both calculable, it only makes sense that I use a method of research that looks for the correlation between 2 or more quantifiable variables. However, just in case I needed more data, I also collected other demographic info about the characters. My first step is to collect the data for analysis. Before I even started data collection, however, I had pre-selected what types of physical disability I would look at. That way, it was easier to process and analyze. I chose characters with amputated limbs, paraplegic, blind, mute, and deaf characters. I then started to collect other quantifiable information about disabled characters, such as character name, type of disability, type of ability, ethnicity, alias, and year of creation or year of disablement. I chose this information to collect as it could all play a role in why disabled characters are given the abilities that they are, since all of these play a role in implicit bias. I most likely would not be able to use all of this information. However, if I ever decided to continue this research more expansively, it would be nice to have this information at the ready and not have to go looking. I collected this information from the comics themselves. However, a few things are never explicitly stated anywhere. For example, ethnicity. In the comic, the character might just be referred to as Asian or alien. In that case, they are marked down as undisclosed Asian minority or even just undisclosed minority. Overall, I attempted to collect over 11 characters for each pre-selected disability type per comic company. That way, I could choose which 10 data points to showcase later. Unfortunately, in some cases, 10 data points wasn't possible as 10 characters with that disability did not exist within that company. From there, I put the data that I collected into 2 separate spreadsheets, one for data from Marvel Comics and one for data from DC Comics. Then I opened columns for each of the data points and input all my data. From there, I grouped characters and their data based on type of disability within each comic company. As some characters have multiple abilities, I made the decision to count each extra ability as an extra data point. I then copied the abilities column into another column so that I could go on and type in general ability type. A majority of fictional characters have extremely specific abilities that do not appear anywhere else in comics. So to better analyze the data, I grouped abilities based on the general type so that the correlations are more obvious. For example, merging telepathy, telekinesis, and mind control, since they are all abilities that have to do with the mind. The other groupings of abilities are enhanced physical ability, manipulation of specific matter, flight, teleportation, healing, enhanced senses, and no ability. I still kept the column of specific ability types. That way, if I was able to see a correlation in overall ability type, I could then go in and see if there was a correlation in specific ability type. Since I am unable to gather information on every single character from Marvel and DC Comics, I decided to only keep 10 characters worth of data total. In order to do this, I put all that I gathered per each disability into graphs so that I could see which abilities were the least prevalent. Then, in order to enhance the largest percentages, I went through and deleted data points until I only had 10 characters worth of data points left in my graphs. That way, my data would not be skewed. Once I had done that, I put my data into color-coded bar graphs based on the abilities for both expanded and condensed abilities. Overall, I collected 113 data points. However, in order to create a non-skewed chart, 19 points were discarded to enhance the largest percentages and get 94 total data points. There were supposed to be 10 characters tested per company per disability to get an even 100. However, only 4 deaf DC characters could be found. For some sections, there might be more than 10 data points, even though only 10 characters were used. This is because some characters have multiple abilities, and each of those was counted as separate data points. In each chart, overall color links to general ability type. Red means no ability, orange means enhanced physical ability, green means mind ability, teal means enhanced sense, blue is manipulation of a specific matter, and those that fit into no specific category are in shades of purple. For the charts of specific powers, the types of abilities available are no ability, enhanced strength, overall increased abilities, sharpened teeth, wall crawling, invulnerability, photographic reflexes, scototopic vision, telepathy, telekinesis, precognition, mind control, vision displacement, enhanced senses, manipulation of a limited matter, temperature manipulation, energy manipulation, cosmic energy manipulation, light manipulation, flight, teleportation, magic, and healing. So many. Each of those is in a shade of color for their general ability type. Figure 1 depicts the amount of specific ability per type of disability in both comic companies tested. In general, having no ability was the most common for amputee, mute, paraplegic, and deaf characters. As for actual abilities, for amputee characters, the most common ability was enhanced strength. For mute and paraplegic characters, telepathy was most common. A majority of blind characters tested had enhanced senses, possibly due to authors attempting to compensate for their lack of one sense by enhancing all the rest, which is an interesting imitation of what happens to blind people in real life. Deaf characters' most common ability was tied between flight and telepathy. Figure 2 depicts the amount of condensed ability per type of disability in both comic companies tested. For mute, paraplegic, deaf, and deaf characters, their most common ability was, again, having no ability. As for actual abilities, amputees are most likely to have an enhanced strength, while mute, blind, deaf, and paraplegic characters are most likely to have a mind ability. To properly assess why amputees are most likely to have enhanced strength, it is imperative to look at amputees in reality and see how they are viewed. In the real world, soldiers are often seen as heroes, the fighters. In World War II, around 15,000 soldiers had limbs amputated. It is possible that this caused the general public to view people with amputated limbs as war heroes, causing comic book authors to unknowingly give characters with amputated limbs more physical abilities that they could use in a fight. The data supports this because amputees are the only ones on the chart that have a physical ability as their largest percentage, and they are also the only ones on the chart that have a disability that affects a limb while still allowing them to move fairly freely. As for mute, paraplegic, blind, and deaf characters, all of them had a mind ability as their largest percentage. This could be due to the fact that society as a whole views physically disabled people as less capable, and therefore authors do not want to give them an ability that would actually enhance their physical body. According to my research, there's a correlation between type of physical ability and type of super ability given in Marvel and DC Comics. Specifically, characters with amputated limbs and blind characters. For the purpose of my research, I counted below 30% of data points to be the cutoff for any correlation. Meanwhile, 45% and above was considered a strong correlation. For characters with amputated limbs, there's a strong correlation with having an enhanced physical ability. 50% of characters with amputated limbs tested presented with enhanced physical ability. The largest specific ability was enhanced strength, with a total of 25% of amputee characters having that, making up 50% of amputee characters with an enhanced physical ability. There's also a mild correlation between blind characters and having a mind ability, specifically telepathy. 33% of all data points for blind characters were for mind ability, with 50% of those being for telepathy specifically. For mute, deaf, and paraplegic characters, the largest overall ability type was no ability at all. For the purpose of my research, I will largely be disregarding those with no ability and focusing on present abilities, although it is important to consider when looking at the reasoning behind the choices made by comic book authors. The majority overall actual ability type for mute characters was mind ability, making up 25% of all data points collected. Of those 25%, 50% specifically were telepathy. I drew similar conclusions for paraplegic characters, as the majority of data points to overall actual ability were also for mind ability, making up 28% of all data points. Again, 50% of all mind ability data points represented telepathy. Unfortunately for both of these, this is not enough data to call it a correlation, although it could definitely be something to look further into in the future. Deaf characters were tied between mind ability and abilities that could not be bound in any one specific category, such as flight, healing, and teleportation. Both of those categories made up 23% of each data point. Because of this, there is no correlation between type of ability and deafness in comics. As for limiting factors, the main thing that limited me for my specific question was my ability to collect data. For instance, I could only locate 4 deaf characters for DC, which possibly skewed my data for deaf characters overall, as Marvel had many deaf characters to know. Another limitation was my question in general. Due to the nature of the AP research program, I only looked at type of disability and type of ability. However, I also collected gender, ethnicity, and date of creation / year of disablement for each character. It would have been extremely interesting and enlightening to dive into how each of these impacted the relationship between disability and ability, but due to the constraints and the length of this paper, I did not. Another idea would have been highly enlightening to look into is other types of disabilities beyond my pre-selected 5. I would have also loved to include physical disabilities such as cerebral palsy, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and various other genetic conditions. However, again, due to the constraints on the length of this paper and the number of characters with these disabilities currently in comics, that was not possible at this time. We can only assume the effect this research will have. We've already proven that the way people are portrayed impacts how you interact with them and think about them. So if disabled people in comics are portrayed stereotypically, with either an acknowledged or unacknowledged stereotype, then those who read these comic books with physically disabled characters are not only absorbing the story, but also most likely unknowingly absorbing the author's implicit biases about disabled people. This changes how those readers interact with disabled people in real life. The scope of my research does not prove the reasoning behind the assigning of certain abilities, however, it does give some possibilities. A majority of those possibilities are highly concerning if they were to be internalized and transferred. As an example, it was stated that a possibility for the percentage of no ability data points being so high was the authors subconsciously thinking that disabled people are incapable. As a physically disabled person myself, I believe that it is all the more important to educate the public on how disabled people live to ensure that these uninformed ideas from comics, movies, television do not continue to be commonplace. In order to continue to enjoy these media sources without perpetuating these stereotypes and ideas, there are a few steps not only we as consumers can take, but also those who work for comic companies can involve themselves in. First of all, write and produce these comics should take a major step towards excluding stereotypes. For example, the authors can do their best to examine their personal biases against disabled people and do their best to educate and fight against those biases. Another idea would be for the companies themselves to put together a screening board to ensure that no comics get published that either accidentally or purposefully include an author's implicit bias. The screening board should include a majority of disabled people, as they are more likely to recognize the discrepancies. As for us as consumers, we can also take steps to educate ourselves both about people with disabilities themselves and our biases against them. While consuming media, particularly comics, including disabled characters, we should take the time to examine how those characters are being treated by others, how and why the character is disabled in the first place, and the personality and abilities given to that character in relationship with their identity as a disabled person. Disabled people should not have to feel judged for things outside of their control. They should not have to fight back against stereotypes perpetuated by the media. As shown by my research, biases and stereotypes about disabled people are constantly being perpetuated in comics, specifically towards the blind and those with amputated limbs. Going forward, the comic community as a whole should do their best to fight these stereotypes and make the community a better and safer place for all. And then there are my so many citations.
Matt, we'll now move on to the oral defense portion of this presentation. Your first question will come from the research and inquiry process category. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your process?
So when I was designing my research, I thought that I would be able to get so many data points for every single one of the pre-selected disabilities that I had chosen. However, when I actually went in to collect my data and analyze my research, I realized that I could only barely find 11 data points for a majority of disabilities. And for deaf characters, specifically in DC, I could only find 4. And I was really upset because that skewed my data and I didn't want skewed data. So I had to go back in and edit my methodology and how I was going to continue my research in accordance with that.
Your second question will come from the depth of understanding category. How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
For future research in the field, can you repeat that?
How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
My findings provide directions for future research in the field as I specifically collected more information that was necessary so that either I myself later on or other researchers could go back in and continue this research without having to go and find more information. However, I also have the sources so they can go back in and collect more information if necessary. It's all in one place on my big old chart that I love.
And then, your final question comes from the reflection throughout the inquiry process category. If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
Oh, I think I actually talked about this. So, to do differently, I would definitely expand my research question to include the relationship between ethnicity, date of creation / date of disablement, how and why they were disabled, gender, all of that. And I would look at that in relationship to their disability and their abilities. I would also love to include, again, more types of disability than just my pre-selected 5, such as various genetic disorders. I would also love to actually see more comics and spend more time diving into and finding more data points and more characters with my pre-selected 5 disabilities.
Beck, you have now completed all the requirements of the AP Capstone program. Congratulations.
Wow.